They say the desert never forgets, that its silence isn't emptiness, it's memory, buried in sand and waiting to rise. When I stepped out of the Uber, the Arizona sun slapped my face like a long-lost relative with unfinished business. I had been gone 6 months on a forensic consulting project in Europe. Now I was back, suitcase in one hand, the deed to my late aunt's 50-acre desert property in the other. I expected wildflowers, mesquite trees, and silence. Instead, I saw beige. Rows and rows of identical beige homes stretched across the land like an infection. Curved streets lined with manicured lawns, sparkling driveways, and that dreaded emblem at the entrance, Crystal Ridge, a premier HOA community. My gut twisted. I'd seen scams before: fake mortgages, title theft, shell companies laundering land, but never one this audacious. The sales office was a glass-walled temple of excess marble floors, chandeliers, and a receptionist too cheerful for a woman standing on stolen soil. Interested in Phase 2, she chirped. I pulled out the deed and laid it flat on her marble countertop. No. I'm interested in why there are houses on my land. Her smile faltered, just for a breath, then snapped back into place. You must be Mr. Elridge. Ms. Holloway, our HOA president, expected you might stop by. Her office is just across the courtyard. I walked through a development built like a fortress, security cameras on every corner. Private patrols. Residents who looked at me like I'd tracked mud onto holy ground. I used to play under that oak tree. Now it was a fountain surrounded by concrete benches. Vivian Holloway waited in a corner office that looked more Supreme Court than HOA. Late 50s. Silver bob. A law degree from Columbia hung behind her like a weapon. Marcus, she said with syrupy calm, sliding a folder across the desk. We followed every legal procedure. Notices were sent to the address on file. The address, my aunt's house. Demolished 2 years ago. No mailbox, no forwarding, but every certified mail receipt neatly documented. She leaned back, eyes gleaming with practiced indifference. We're not obligated to track down property owners who fail to update their contact. I kept my voice steady. You knew that address was dead. Her smile widened. We followed the book. But I had read that book. Hell, I'd written parts of it. And something about her arrogance told me this wasn't incompetence. It was precision. A setup. What she didn't know, I wasn't just an heir with a grudge. I was a forensic trap with a pulse. And she'd just stepped into me. Vivian Holloway had smiled like a woman who thought she held every card. But as I walked out of her glass castle and into the grid of beige boxes she called a community, I knew better. That wasn't the face of someone confident. That was the face of someone bluffing and praying the other player didn't call. I began walking. Not with a purpose. Not yet. Just letting my instincts take over. As a forensic investigator, I'd always trusted my peripheral vision more than the obvious. And Crystal Ridge, for all its polished sameness, was bleeding with signs if you knew where to look. The streets bore names designed to distract Emerald Loop, Topaz Lane, Opal Crescent. Pretty artificial. But behind the symmetry lay surveillance security cameras perched discreetly on every lamppost, angled with surgical intent. Some homes had their own additional systems redundant, but suggestive. Fear lived here, dressed as luxury. A private security SUV rolled past me slowly, its tinted windows swallowing the Arizona sun. The driver didn't wave, didn't even blink, just cataloged me. I had the distinct feeling that somewhere a screen had lit up with my face. I passed manicured lawns so pristine they looked synthetic, bordered by identical shrubs trimmed to exact proportions. Not a leaf out of place, not a crack in the sidewalks. It didn't feel natural. It felt curated, manufactured, like a movie set pretending to be a neighborhood. A jogger passed, slowing just a little. A woman in yoga pants walked her golden retriever and subtly turned to look twice. I was the variable that didn't fit the formula, and Crystal Ridge didn't like variables. I approached what used to be the eastern boundary of my aunt's land, where her wildflower meadow had grown wild and beautiful. Now, it was paved over, divided into perfect cul-de-sacs. I paused by a lot marked Phase 3, coming 2025. They were planning to expand. The theft wasn't over. It was escalating. Back at my hotel that night, I opened my laptop and started pulling property records. I worked the county assessor's database, tax rolls, and real estate filings. Within hours, patterns began to emerge, quiet ones, like whispers behind closed doors. Crystal Ridge had absorbed more than just my land. In the past 5 years, 14 other parcels once independently owned had folded into the HOA. Almost all were inherited plots from deceased seniors or absentee family members. Each takeover had the same procedural fig leaf notices sent to outdated addresses, no reply, then a quiet conversion into HOA jurisdiction. And then came the email. It arrived around 2:15 a.m. from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Want the truth." The body was short, precise. "I know what happened to your aunt's land. Meet me at Finch and Grady's cafe. Tensure me. Ask for Ava. Sit by the window. Come alone. No signature. No threat. Just a proposition." I stared at it for a long time. Could have been a trap. Could have been a prank. Or most likely, it was someone like me. Someone burned by Vivian and her machine. I arrived early. Finch and Grady's was tucked away on the outskirts of town, far enough from Crystal Ridge to be unnoticed, but close enough to feel its shadow. It was the kind of place with chipped mugs and handwritten menus, where locals argued over sports teams and politics like it still mattered. A good choice for a discreet meeting. I ordered black coffee and took the window booth. The morning sun crawled across the linoleum floor, and the smell of bacon hovered in the air. Every time the bell above the door rang, I looked up. Most were regulars. 1 or 2 glanced at me too long. At 10:00 sharp, she walked in, late 20s, maybe early 30s, navy pantsuit, hair in a tight bun. Her eyes moved fast, calculated but tired. She spotted me instantly and approached without hesitation. "Ava Monroe," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. No small talk. Just the name. Like a confession. I nodded. "Marcus Elridge." She looked around once, then opened her briefcase. "I used to work for Vivian. 3 years ago. Right out of law school. I thought I'd made it." Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a folder. Took me 6 months to realize what she really was. The documents she laid out were damning emails with time-stamped edits, internal memos, scanned signatures that didn't match official records. But what chilled me was the strategy behind it all. The playbook was methodical: target elderly landowners, use arcane HOA clauses, claim legal abandonment, then absorb the property under a false veil of compliance. "She calls it urban harvesting," Ava said quietly, eyes on the page, like it's some sort of civic gardening project. "She knows my aunt died," I said. "They sent every notice to an address that no longer existed." "She knew," Ava confirmed, pulling out a printed email. "This one's from 3 months before the first notice." "The old woman's gone," Vivian wrote. "Send the paperwork to the shell address and let it marinate. No one's coming." I clenched my jaw. The language was surgical, cold, like death was just another loophole. "Why me?" I asked finally. "Why now?" Ava leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Because your aunt was my mentor. She knew what was happening. She left everything to you because you're not just family, you're the one person who could fight this, and because—" She hesitated. She didn't think she'd live long enough to see it finished. I sat back, the weight of it all pressing down. I had come back to settle. Instead, I had stepped into a war. "You're not the only one," Ava added. There are others, other families, other stolen properties. Crystal Ridge is just the beginning. I looked at the folder again. In the middle was a map. 15 red dots. Each one a victim. Each one another story buried beneath beige rooftops and freshly poured concrete. The fortress had cracks, and I planned to widen them. The red dots on Ava's map burned into my mind like coals. Each one marked a life uprooted, a memory erased, a crime disguised as urban progress. I knew then that this wasn't just about my aunt's land anymore. This was systemic, industrial. And Vivian Holloway wasn't just a villain, she was a mastermind. Ava and I left the cafe through the back exit, avoiding the main street. She walked quickly, glancing over her shoulder like someone who had reason to fear shadows. Back at my hotel room, she opened her briefcase wider this time. What she brought out wasn't just evidence, it was a damn autopsy. There's something you need to see, she said, spreading out the documents on the bed. Vivian doesn't just run Crystal Ridge. She built the entire scheme, and it's not limited to Arizona. She handed me a file labeled Interstate Projects. Inside were photographs of similarly pristine developments in Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, all governed by HOAs, all following the same pattern: elderly landowners, stagnant records, predatory bylaws, forced compliance, then, quietly, profit. She calls it decentralized consolidation, Ava said bitterly. That's how she pitches it to her partners. A way to control land without ever owning it outright. Everything hidden in plain sight, protected by legal fog. I leafed through page after page of internal memos and correspondence. One email chain made my blood run cold. Target confirmed, deceased. Begin process. Notices to be sent to prior address for appearance of legality. Document every step, optics are key. The sender was Vivian herself. The recipient, Jim Harrison. That name had come up before a developer. I'd seen it on the signs around Crystal Ridge. But in these emails, he was more than just a builder. He was a co-conspirator. And then Ava pulled out the contract. Forged signatures. Faked notarizations. And the smoking gun, a scanned copy of a letter my aunt supposedly signed, agreeing to the HOA's Phase 2 expansion. Except the signature wasn't hers. Not even close. I knew that because I had hundreds of her letters stored in boxes. I could identify her script in my sleep. Ava reached into her jacket and handed me a smaller envelope. Your aunt knew they were circling. Before she passed, she had her will revised. She left the land to you not because you were next of kin, but because she believed you were the only one who'd see the game behind the curtain. The envelope contained a letter in familiar handwriting. Marcus, if you're reading this, it means Vivian finally made her move. I tried everything: petitions, reports, complaints. Nothing stuck. They're too entrenched. I watched good people lose their land, their dignity. I won't let this land become another trophy for them. Look beneath the oak tree by the creek. I buried what they feared most, the truth. Trust Ava. She's one of the few who still believes in justice. Love, Aunt M. I folded the letter slowly, letting the words settle into my chest like gravel. She knew. I murmured. She fought, Ava corrected, and she nearly blew the whole operation open 3 years ago. That's when they got aggressive. I think they accelerated her decline. I looked at her sharply. You mean, I can't prove it, Ava admitted. But she was healthy, independent. Then she suddenly collapsed, never recovered. I saw Vivian meet with her doctor at a private fundraiser. Weeks later, your aunt was gone. Draw your own conclusions. The implications burned. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but after everything I'd read, I knew better. Ava opened another folder. Your aunt kept everything. She was documenting it for years. Audio recordings, letters to the state bar, complaints to the attorney general, even a private investigator's report. The PI file was brutal. Surveillance photos, phone records, a log of late-night meetings between Vivian, Harrison, and various public officials, including a judge I recognized from the local courthouse. She wasn't just protecting her land, Ava whispered. She was trying to expose a criminal enterprise, and they silenced her before she could. I stood there, surrounded by paper ghosts and echoes of a war I hadn't even known I'd inherited. But now that I had, I wasn't going to be a passive heir. "What's under the oak?" I asked. Ava gave me a look. "Let's find out." We waited until nightfall. I didn't trust daylight. Not anymore. We parked half a mile from the old creek path, then hiked in through the brush. The oak tree was still there, barely. Its roots curled around the base of a decorative walking trail Vivian had built to cover the natural landmarks. But I knew the spot. I remembered sitting under that tree when I was 12, playing with fossils while Aunt Em read legal thrillers beside me. We dug in silence, 3 feet down. Ava's shovel hit something solid, a waterproof case. I opened it, expecting deeds or letters. What I found was more dangerous original HOA Foundation documents, audio tapes of Vivian planning backroom deals, and geological surveys showing trace gas deposits beneath the land. "Now I get it," I whispered. "It wasn't just the development, it was what's under it." Ava nodded grimly. "Vivian's fast-tracking a deal with Excelsior Energy. Once she finalizes ownership, she sells the mineral rights for $50 million. That's why your aunt became a threat. That's why they buried every complaint she made. And that's why you're next." I zipped the case shut and looked out toward the maze of beige rooftops blinking in the distance. Let them watch. Let them try. They thought they were building an empire. But all they built was a case. And I planned to bring it crashing down. The waterproof case felt heavier than its size should have allowed, as if it contained not just evidence, but the weight of every life Vivian Holloway had trampled on her way to empire. Back at the hotel, I laid its contents out on the table slowly, reverently. These weren't just papers. They were weapons, and I would wield them carefully. There were 7 cassette tapes, each labeled in Aunt Em's meticulous handwriting: Holloway 31217, Harrison phone call 68, meeting, HOA board, private recording. Alongside them, a thick journal with the initials M.E. On the cover, Margaret Elridge's voice preserved in ink. Inside were pages of detailed observations, meetings noted by time and location, names of people she'd overheard, license plates, cash exchanges. Dates matched perfectly with what Ava had already uncovered. But the most valuable item, the one that turned my hands cold, was a set of geological survey maps from 1997. I unfolded the large, yellowed paper and saw the truth in red marker ink. High-grade methane pockets confirmed. Potential natural gas reserves, viable extraction depth. There it was, the reason. This wasn't just about land. It wasn't even about development. It was about what lay beneath a buried gold mine of energy, invisible to the naked eye, yet priceless to anyone with the greed to reach for it. Vivian had built her suburban paradise, not as a neighborhood, but as a facade camouflage for a future drilling contract worth tens of millions. She never intended for those houses to last. I murmured, "They're placeholders." Ava sat across from me, eyes dark with realization. She builds. She waits. Then she discovers the environmental issue she created, condemns the structures, and walks away with the mineral rights. My mind raced. I knew the laws, federal and state. If a development is deemed unsafe due to environmental concerns, and the HOA owns the improvements but not the land, condemnation leads to a fire sale of ownership, and if no one contests the rights, the underlying estate defaults to the last recorded title. Me. She was going to poison the land to claim it, I said aloud. And if that didn't work, she had fallback options, bribes, forged buyouts, forceful evictions disguised as HOA code enforcement. I began drawing. It was a habit of mine, building visual trees of information. From Vivian at the center, I branched out to Jim Harrison, developer and enforcer. Then came the architects who approved plans without inspections. Then the notary whose stamp expired 3 years ago. I followed the funding trail through a shell corporation in Nevada and into a political PAC. And there he was, Senator Lowell Greaves, publicly clean, privately bought. The money looped through Greaves's campaign fund and funneled back into Harrison's construction budget. HOA dues intended for landscaping and infrastructure were repurposed as hush money. It was a perfectly insulated machine. Until now. I needed Viviane to believe she was still safe, still in control. That was Ava's job. "You're sure you want to do this?" I asked her. She looked me square in the eye. "I already lost everything once. A career, reputation. What else are they going to take my sleep?" We rehearsed her return like theater. Ava would go back to Viviane, claim she wanted redemption, offer her help neutralizing me before I got too noisy. Her excuse: "I've been watching Marcus spiral. He's out of his depth. He doesn't want war, just a check." It had to be believable, desperate, and flattering enough to feed Viviane's ego. Meanwhile, I prepared the next stage, the resident meeting. Crystal Ridge's HOA board hosted monthly gatherings, usually sparsely attended. But I requested a special assembly. According to HOA bylaws, section 7.3, which I had highlighted in my copy, any landowner whose property was under dispute had the right to present a claim to the community, as long as they did so with 72 hours' notice. I filed it. I rented a portable speaker system, printed visual aids, prepared a folder for each household with copies of survey data, HOA emails, and a digestible timeline of the fraud. I didn't want drama. I wanted clarity. If I was going to turn the residents into allies, they needed to see not just the villain, but the victim. All of them. The day before the meeting, Ava sent me a burner text. She took the bait, said she wants to offer you a settlement, call it a graceful exit. She's bringing in Harrison tomorrow. Perfect. I spent the next 12 hours refining every angle of the confrontation. I had audio ready, documents tabbed, a script memorized but flexible. It wasn't about embarrassing her. It was about letting her speak, letting her arrogance do the work. But there was one more thing I needed. That night, I drove back to the edge of the creek and stood beneath the oak tree. I thought of my aunt, of how she must have felt, watching her world shrink while the system failed her. She hadn't just left me a case. She'd left me a legacy, a final assignment. I whispered into the wind. I won't let her bury you under beige walls and fake smiles. I'll finish what you started. Then I turned back toward the lights of Crystal Ridge. The meeting was tomorrow, and the truth was coming with me. The oak tree had stood for generations watching as my aunt built a quiet fortress of truth beneath its roots. Now, I was carrying that truth into enemy territory. The night before the HOA meeting, I barely slept. I didn't need rest. I needed resolve. At 6:00 p.m. sharp, I arrived at the Crystal Ridge Community Center. It looked like a country club: polished floors, granite countertops, an American flag draped neatly beside a wall of plaques, all of it funded, ironically, by the very people who were about to find out they'd been conned. The residents filed in, some curious, others hostile. I recognized a few faces from childhood, older now and wary, parents with toddlers, retirees with folded arms, everyone dressed in the same suburban uniform of muted comfort. I, on the other hand, wore a plain gray suit and brought only two things: a manila folder and the truth. Viviane Holloway stood at the podium, immaculate as always. Navy blazer, diamond brooch, her silver hair twisted into a power bun. She greeted the crowd with practiced warmth and glanced at me as if I were a mild inconvenience, a pothole on an otherwise smooth road. "Thank you all for attending on such short notice," she began. "As many of you have heard, Mr. Marcus Elridge, heir to the property on which our beautiful community was built, has raised certain concerns. We wanted to give him the opportunity to address us directly. She gestured toward me with that same smile I'd seen her use in court depositions. The kind that said, "You can speak, but I own the room." I stepped forward. "Good evening," I said, letting my voice carry. "Some of you may remember me. I grew up on this land. Played beneath that oak tree you now call the reflection fountain. I didn't come back to start a war. I came home and found my inheritance paved over and sold." A ripple moved through the room. Discomfort, confusion. I was told the development was legal, that proper notices were sent. But when I examined the documents when I followed the trail, I discovered a very different story. I pulled out my phone and tapped play. Vivian's voice filled the speakers. Casual, confident, cutting. Of course I knew the old bat was dead. That's why I sent the notices there. Marcus was sipping wine in Europe. By the time he got home, we'd have it all locked down. Gasps. A few heads turned sharply toward her. Vivian's smile flickered but held. "Out of context," she said quickly. "That could be anyone I cut her off. I also have a forensic analysis of your voice patterns. Matches with 98% certainty. But let's move on." I placed packets on the front table. Ava had helped prepare them. These documents include the original environmental reports that were deliberately hidden. I held up a colored scan. This land contains high levels of methane and chemical seepage from an abandoned irrigation site buried years ago. It required remediation before any development. That never happened. Now the crowd stirred louder. A man in a Crystal Ridge jogging jacket stood up. "My kid plays in that soil every day," he snapped. "Are you saying it's toxic?" I nodded solemnly. "Enough to make your HOA's building permits fraudulent, and enough to hold every board member, especially your president, personally liable." More voices joined in demands for explanation. Accusations of betrayal. Vivian raised her hand. "Let's not get carried away," she said. "These are just claims, none of them proven." "Then let's prove it," I said, pulling out the next card. "Here's an invoice for a private testing agency paid with HOA funds, dated 2 years ago. It shows they did test the soil and chose not to share the results." I paused for breath. "And here's where it gets worse. The HOA fund has been used to finance not just landscaping and street lighting, but also legal fees for 3 unrelated fraud cases involving Miss Holloway personally." The crowd erupted now. A woman clutched her purse and whispered to the man beside her. Someone else shouted, "I want to see the books." A teenager near the back was filming everything on his phone. Jim Harrison, seated in the front row in a designer golf shirt, rose slowly. "Look, buddy," he drawled, "you can rant all you want, but unless you want to spend the next decade tied up in court, I suggest you take the offer." "What offer?" someone asked. Vivian forced a smile. "We're prepared to offer Mr. Elridge $200,000 as a gesture of goodwill. That land was worth $5 million before you poisoned it," I said evenly. "And now it's a liability bomb waiting to explode." She turned to the crowd, her voice silky. "We've followed the bylaws. We have documentation. We acted in good faith." I stepped forward, my voice cold now. Good faith doesn't laugh at a dead woman's mailbox. Good faith doesn't bury contamination reports. And good faith sure as hell doesn't funnel community dues into offshore accounts. I tapped the folder again. "Because here's the real kicker. Every house here was built illegally. And under Arizona Revised Statute 420173, any improvement made in bad faith belongs to the rightful landowner." A long pause. I looked out at the faces. "That's me." Gasps, shuffling. The weight of that sentence sank like stone. Vivian's voice cracked. "He's bluffing. That law hasn't been enforced in decades, but it was cited last year." I interrupted. "In Peterson-Verrall, Maricopa County, and upheld." A man stood. Are you saying he owns our homes? No. I said, I'm saying you were lied to. But I'm not here to steal houses. I'm here to make sure you know what's really happening and to hold the people who built this fraud accountable. I looked directly at Vivian, and the time for masks is over. The room was no longer hers. It was mine. The room had turned. Vivian no longer held the attention of Crystal Ridge. She had lost it, and she knew it. The cold confidence in her eyes had flickered, and what replaced it wasn't fear. It was calculation. And that made her more dangerous than ever. 3 days later, she struck back. I was served while walking out of a meeting with Ava legal summons, motion for injunction, and a lawsuit claiming defamation, harassment, and intentional interference with contractual relations. Vivian Holloway had declared war, but in her haste to silence me, she made a fatal mistake. Her legal team submitted hundreds of pages of documents, most of it meant to paint me as unstable, aggressive, and opportunistic. They referenced the community meeting, labeled me a hostile disruptor, and argued that my presence endangered the HOA's cohesion. They even included financial statements, perhaps to demonstrate the supposed damage I had caused to Crystal Ridge's reputation. That was her undoing, because in those statements were entries that didn't match public HOA filings. Transfers from resident dues to offshore entities, payments marked consulting fees to companies with no business licenses, and one particularly damning wire to an account registered under a shell company that, as of last year, had been under IRS investigation for real estate laundering. Vivian had walked into court trying to bury me. Instead, she handed me the shovel. I filed a counter motion. Within 48 hours, we were scheduled for a preliminary hearing at the Maricopa County Courthouse. Judge Harriet Lorne presided, mid-60s, sharp as a scalpel, and with a reputation for detesting procedural abuse. She didn't tolerate showmanship, and she didn't forget faces. I remembered her from a tax fraud case I'd testified in years ago. She had a memory like a vault and a glare that could curdle blood. The courtroom was tense. Vivian sat flanked by 2 attorneys. I walked in alone. Mr. Elridge, the judge began, reviewing the paperwork. Your response to the injunction claims that the plaintiff has inadvertently submitted evidence of financial fraud. Yes, Your Honor, I said, keeping my voice steady. I have reviewed their submitted bank statements and identified at least 7 transactions consistent with classic laundering techniques, in violation of both state and federal statutes. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Do you have supporting analysis? I handed her a copy of my forensic audit, cross-referenced with Arizona's HOA Financial Transparency Act. She flipped through it silently, then turned to Vivian's counsel. Counselor, she said coolly, did your client review these documents before including them in the public record? The junior attorney stammered. We were under deadline. Your Honor, our intent was to demonstrate financial integrity. Which you've done, the judge said, snapping the folder shut. Just not in the way you hoped. Vivian's lips tightened into a straight line. Her eyes never left mine. I knew then she wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to run out the clock. After the hearing, Ava and I met in the parking garage, away from prying ears. She's accelerating, Ava said. She's rushing to finalize every remaining sale. 16 homes closed in the last 48 hours. No inspections. Cash-only deals. She's trying to muddy the waters. I said, the more buyers, the more entangled the ownership web becomes. She wants to create so many claims that no one can unwind it all. She also filed a permit for demolition, Ava added grimly. They're calling it Project Clean Sweep. Guess where it starts? My stomach dropped. The original homes. The oldest part of the neighborhood. The ones built directly over the land Vivian knew I now legally controlled. She was going to declare the area contaminated, force residents out through emergency HOA ordinances, and redevelop the space likely into something she could sell to Excelsior Energy. She's using environmental decay as a weapon, I muttered. She pollutes the land, blames it on time, then uses that to evict people and start over. She's betting no one will stop her in time. Ava said, "She's wrong." That night, I organized a second meeting, this time not with the HOA, but with the residents. Word had spread. What had begun as skepticism had transformed into fury. I explained everything slowly, clearly, legally. I outlined their rights. I gave them proof. They didn't just listen. They mobilized. Within 72 hours, we had 89 sworn affidavits detailing suspicious practices, irregular transactions, sudden inspections, fines with no justification. An elderly couple produced a signed document Vivian had convinced them to authorize without legal counsel, handing over lifetime rights to their land in exchange for community improvements. The real turning point came when Connell Briggs, a longtime resident and local contractor, stepped forward with copies of engineering reports. "These houses," he said, holding up blueprints, "were built on unstable soil without foundational compensation." She cut every corner. "These homes aren't just unethical, they're unsafe." I filed a motion for injunctive relief and emergency review. This time, I had 112 signatures backing the claim. The judge heard the case the next morning. After presenting everything, I made my final argument. "Your Honor," I said, "under Arizona law, any structure built on privately owned land without the owner's consent, and especially under false pretenses, belongs to the landowner." "That would be me." Judge Lorne leaned forward. "Are you suggesting you now own 120 homes only by legal default?" I replied. "And I propose this: I will sell each home back to its current occupant for their original purchase price, minus any fraudulent fees, and place the proceeds into a remediation and restitution fund." The courtroom was dead silent. Finally, Judge Lorne nodded. "A remarkably equitable solution. Mr. Elridge, motion granted. Emergency injunction upheld. Demolitions are hereby suspended." Vivian shot to her feet. "You can't do this. This is my community." The judge gave her a cold look. "Ms. Holloway, this community belongs to the people who live in it. You merely managed their trust and violated it." Vivian didn't sit down. She stood frozen, realizing that the hole she had spent years digging for others had finally opened beneath her own feet. She fell in. Vivian didn't just fall, she shattered. And the crack she left behind ran through every layer of the empire she'd spent decades constructing. The moment the judge granted the injunction, everything she'd buried, every forgery, every bribe, every deceitful maneuver began crawling to the surface like rot breaking through paint. The FBI reached out the next morning. Special Agent David Chen met me in an unmarked office outside Phoenix. His handshake was firm, his voice calm, but behind his eyes I saw the flicker of recognition, the kind that comes when a seemingly small case suddenly reveals the tip of something national. "We've been watching Harrison for over a year," he said, gesturing toward a pin-covered map behind him. "Shell companies, false deeds, suspicious transfers. But we couldn't link him to anyone big enough to trigger federal prosecution until your tapes, your audit, and that warehouse stunt with Vivian." I passed over the flash drive Ava had compiled. "She offered me $8 million in cash. It came directly from HOA funds. We have it recorded." Chen's eyebrows rose. "You brought the bait and the hook." "No," I corrected. "She brought both. I just gave her a place to hang herself." 3 days later, Vivian was arrested in a sting operation at a luxury condo she kept under an alias. She'd been preparing to flee passport, burner phones, even hair dye in a travel kit. When they cuffed her, she told agents, "You have no idea who you're messing with." But they did. Because the moment she was in custody, she started talking. It took less than 48 hours for her to roll on Jim Harrison. He was caught at the Mexican border trying to cross with a fake identity and a suitcase full of forged building permits. The man who once strutted through community meetings with golf tans and fake charm now wept in an interrogation room, offering spreadsheets and offshore account passwords like peace offerings. The FBI confirmed over $30 million had been laundered through HOA-connected developments across 4 states. But the real earthquake came with the name Vivian whispered into the microphone during her fifth debrief Senator Lowell Greaves. She described private dinners, campaign donations disguised as infrastructure grants, and backroom promises in exchange for silence and political favors. She even had recorded voicemails Greaves joking about those HOA peasants and promising emergency zoning overrides in exchange for a slice of the mineral rights deal. The FBI didn't wait. Within a week, federal agents raided the senator's home and office. His name was plastered across every major network. His fall was theatrical, complete with a public statement of innocence, which only made the footage of his private jet being seized more damning. Back in Crystal Ridge, the mood shifted from fear to resolve. With Vivian gone and the injunction upheld, a special election was called. For the first time, residents were able to vote for an entirely new HOA board. The bylaws were amended, requiring a supermajority for any major policy change, mandatory financial disclosures, and independent third-party audits. Connell Briggs, formerly a quiet contractor, was elected as the new HOA president by an overwhelming margin. His first act, renamed the reflection fountain back to its original title, Margaret's Oak. At the community meeting following the vote, Connell stood in front of the crowd holding up one of the forged violation letters Vivian had sent him years ago. "From now on," he said, voice clear and steady, "no one here gets silenced, no one gets fined for speaking up. We're neighbors, not tenants. This place belongs to all of us." Applause thundered through the room. I watched from the back, unseen, and I smiled. Ava, meanwhile, had turned fire into purpose. She launched her own law firm, Monroe & Shield, specializing in defending homeowners against HOA abuse and fraudulent development practices. Within 6 months, she had 3 offices across the Southwest and a backlog of clients who had once been too afraid to fight back. I funded her quietly, not for charity, not even out of gratitude, but because I believed in the war she was waging. One that started in my aunt's wildflower field and now spread across 12 states. We discovered more victims. Elderly widows in Nevada, a veteran's family in Utah, an abandoned church in New Mexico bulldozed for a luxury spa project. Each case followed the same script: outdated contact information, fabricated consent, and a community vision that looked more like a cover-up. But now, with Vivian's full confession, they all had legal standing. Ava's firm led a multi-state class action, while the Department of Justice expanded its task force into HOA-related corruption. Crystal Ridge, once a fortress of silence, became a model of reform. The residents formed committees for transparency, accountability, and conflict resolution. The neighborhood newsletter changed its tone from passive HOA bulletins to resident-written stories, updates on legislative reform, and tips on spotting fraud. A community garden bloomed on the very plot where Vivian had planned to build her energy access road. I was invited to the ribbon cutting, but I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The soil spoke for itself. Later that month, Ava sent me a photograph: kids playing on the grass outside Margaret's Oak. No fences, no signs, no surveillance, just life. I think she'd be proud. Ava wrote beneath it. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I returned to that same spot under the oak tree one last time. I sat with a thermos of black coffee and a notebook, the breeze shifting softly through the leaves. I thought of Aunt Margaret not just as a woman who left behind evidence, but as someone who understood that justice was rarely swift or clean. Sometimes it needed time. And sometimes it needed the right person with the right skills to finish the job. She hadn't chosen me by accident. She had seen what was coming. And now it was falling apart, brick by forged brick. The judge's gavel had barely cooled when the ripple effects began. Vivian's empire hadn't just collapsed, it had detonated. But from that wreckage came something unexpected, something honest, something that grew. Following the sentencing, the federal government launched a wide-scale recovery operation. Frozen assets from Vivian Holloway and Jim Harrison's offshore accounts were redirected under court order. Nearly $28 million was recovered. And because the mineral rights beneath Crystal Ridge had not yet been sold, I made a decision that would define the legacy of everything we had fought for. I transferred them into a community trust, not under my name, not under Ava's, but under the people's. The Crystal Ridge Civic Fund was born a nonprofit controlled by an elected board of residents. Its mandate: invest every cent of future royalties from natural gas or other mineral extraction into education, public safety, environmental restoration, and legal defense for homeowners across the state. It wasn't just symbolic, it was justice with structure. The first initiative, a public elementary school, funded entirely by the trust, built on what had once been Vivian's planned resort ground. It opened 9 months later, Margaret L. Ridge Elementary for Integrity and Public Trust. I attended the ribbon cutting quietly, standing near the back while children ran through the courtyard laughing. My aunt's name, once nearly erased, now stood carved into sandstone above the school entrance. A year after Vivian's arrest, Arizona passed the Elridge Amendment. The bill mandated all HOA correspondence, especially regarding land acquisition or disciplinary action, require multi-point verification, verified delivery, digital confirmation, and third-party oversight. Forged letters, false notices, and procedural silence would no longer suffice. Other states soon adopted similar reforms. I testified during the legislative hearing. It wasn't emotional, it was practical. I spoke as a forensic accountant, not a crusader. I laid out the system flaws, the abuse pathways, the statistical patterns of fraud. When I was finished, one representative asked me if I sought restitution. No. I said, I want resilience. Make sure no one ever has to do what I did again. In Crystal Ridge, the change wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Gone were the silent patrols and paranoid glances. The board meetings now opened with a community roll call, followed by open mic sessions for resident concerns. A committee of volunteer auditors led by Connell Briggs published quarterly financial transparency reports online. People planted gardens where concrete once dominated. Instead of citations for lawn color violations, families received letters of appreciation for helping neighbors. Ava became something more than a lawyer. She became a defender of the disrespected. Monroe and Shield, the firm she founded, expanded to 5 offices across the Southwest and became a sanctuary for victims of predatory HOAs and real estate fraud. The waiting list stretched to 18 months. And still, she never raised her rates. Justice, she said, shouldn't be a luxury product. She refused TV interviews. She declined awards. But she never missed a single community forum in Crystal Ridge. On the anniversary of the court victory, the residents held a gathering under the oak tree, the one that had stood long before the first brick was laid, and long after the last lie had been exposed. The bench beneath it had been restored, and a plaque added beside it, planted in truth, grown in unity. They asked me to speak. I didn't want to, but I did. I told them how justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it takes the shape of a corrected invoice, a revised deed, or a child learning that laws can serve, not just restrain. I reminded them that this wasn't my win, it was theirs. I had only opened the book. They had written the final chapter. After the speeches, as the crowd dispersed, I walked the neighborhood one last time. Crystal Ridge no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. The wildflowers had begun blooming again along the eastern ridge, small, stubborn, radiant against the beige houses. Where Vivian once saw expansion potential, the residents now saw space for a community amphitheater. And where the old sales office stood, Connell was overseeing the construction of a legal resource library, free and open to the public. I passed Margaret's oak. The sunlight caught its leaves like glass. I sat beneath it and listened not for applause, but for quiet, for peace, for the echo of a promise kept. In the distance, children were laughing. Their voices weren't muffled by HOA bylaws or silenced by corporate greed. They belonged to a new chapter, one built not on leverage or fear, but on trust. Justice had been served. Vivian was behind bars, her name synonymous with one of the largest property fraud rings in the country. Jim Harrison was dismantled financially, professionally, and publicly. Senator Greaves had resigned in shame, his legacy erased by greed exposed. They didn't just lose, they became cautionary tales. But me, I didn't want recognition. I wanted restoration. Now the homes that were once born of exploitation had become vessels of healing. The people who once lived under threat now lived with power, and the land, which had nearly been stripped of meaning, was rooted again in something unshakable. That night, I stood alone under the stars and looked at the horizon. Arizona was still hot, still wild, still beautiful. But something in it had shifted. Sometimes the best revenge is restoring what they tried to steal. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens. Sometimes it grows quietly until no one can deny it. Was I too harsh, or did they deserve it? I'd love to hear your take.